count down.
Go on.
Okay. I started.
I started too. He doesn't normally count down, does he?
3.
Always.
I think I do. Sorry.
I think
3,
I'm like programmed. I'm having
Weird.
a
I don't
meltdown.
know. That's not my memory.
3, 2,
got me.
1, commence.
Whatever,
Yes. Thank you.
I guess he does. It's funny. My cue is always just the recording has begun or whatever it is.
That's
on
how
Zoom.
conditioning works. You don't know it. They ring the
Yeah.
bell, you vote conservative.
Victor's conditioned by the Zoom female voice, and you're conditioned
Yeah, I don't
by
even
my
remember you
voice.
counting down. I'm just like, I always have my Audacity open. It's like, recording has, what does it say? I don't even remember. Anyway.
Recording
This
in
me-
progress.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
See, it's so subconscious.
Okay, speaking of conditioning,
Speaking of,
politics,
Good transition.
politics of fear. Now we're going to have to admit we had a project going, and the reasons that it's not going to work are quite interesting. But before we get to that, we have to get to an expression of why this won't work, which was the election debate. Trump versus Biden, round 2. Holy shit, was that ever great.
wasn't that round 1?
Yeah, that was the first one.
Oh, but like you mean in
You
general?
mean
of their
like 4
election?
years ago?
Yeah.
Oh,
got it,
yeah,
got it. It is round
Long
2.
term. Long game, yeah.
And I got to say, Trump seems the same and Biden does not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not everyone thought it went great. Just looking at the Washington Post top most read articles.
Ooh,
was,
what did they say?
Number 1, the debate's biggest loser, the truth. Number 2, Trump is too dangerous for Democrats to stick with Biden. Number 3, 90 minutes of pain. Number 4, Biden's facts are no match for Trump's lies.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's good. That's
Is
a
it
good
true?
point. I mean,
Is it true that this was the first presidential debate televised in history since 1960 where the truth was sacrificed at the altar of American democracy?
Oh, definitely the first ever that happened.
I mean, I
No.
will say that that somehow that it felt more exaggerated, like that dichotomy between like one candidate and then another, like, because I feel like in the past what would happen is that let me think about this. Because like I think in the past, like you'd see lies and exaggerations from both, right? Democrats. And what's funny is like now I feel like one of them is just doing the good old fashioned like exaggerations, and I guess that's Biden just like kind of exaggerating his record, like in like the normal politician lie. But then it's like Trump just like lies with this carelessness, a carefree way that's like almost like vibes based lying. It's just like, well, that just feels wrong to me, so like it's just, I'm just going to connect that back to like immigrants
Yep.
coming over the border.
Some of the highlights were like Democrats are killing babies after they're born. Immigrants
good
are
stuff.
staying in luxury hotels, the hits.
Yeah.
But what you just said, I would have phrased it this way. This is a ritual that broke. And it's not really of any consequence, except an aesthetic one. But like the ritual is always being based on lies. And I wanted to draw attention specifically to 1960, I believe, was the Kennedy-Nixon debate. And I think it broke on entry because it changed politics, obviously a televised debate. But Nixon lost because he looked sweaty and weird on TV, and Kennedy looked good.
Yeah, that's the famous thing. TV changed the kind of political game. Yeah.
And there are those little sound bites that like, they always replay from history, like different kind of fumbles in the debate as if they really mattered.
I mean, I'm so familiar with that media explanation now, like that kind of deterministic, certain people win on the radio, Hitler, Nixon, certain people win on TV, Kennedy. I don't think we should take that as a very good explanation. At least it doesn't cover a lot of bases. It's like, okay, yeah, new way of debating, new way of presenting politicians. Okay, fine. But like, Nixon didn't lose because he got a bit sweaty on TV.
Yeah, exactly.
Nixon was the last president to not have a image consultant or whatever name it goes by, but an image consultant on staff. That became mandatory after televised debates.
Well, they always like, I feel like they pick one moment and then they'll like retroactively be like, oh, that was the moment. But then I'm sure you could find flubs on the other side. And if that person had lost, they would have been like, oh, that was the moment when they lost, right? Like I kind of like remember I wasn't like really that conscious for this, but like I think I remember seeing a thing about like Michael Dukakis in the 80s or something, like getting in like a tank, and it just like looked weird, and he looked like a dweeb, and everyone's like, oh, he got in that tank, and like that's the reason why he lost, because he looked like a dweeb, like an idiot, like uncomfortable. But it's like, who knows? You know, I think he was up against Reagan at that point, right? And then, or no, actually, it was George Bush for the first senior against Michael Dukakis. Yeah, 88, exactly.
Well, I did want to spend at least a minute of reflection on this, because if the New York Times and Washington Post are to be believed, the ritual here was broken, the illusion was dispelled, and somehow the magical third being who was supposed to be on the stage, namely the truth, Sophia herself, only just died this time around. Now, you can't believe that unless you're a moron, because at least you have to admit she died Trump's first time around when he ran through his own party on the debate
Trump
stage.
broke it, for sure. Trump broke the ritual.
But given the benefit of the doubt, if the illusion was working, what is it supposed to look like? Like, what does a proper ritual look like in the Washington Post grimoire?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and this is kind of an aside, but I remember it really struck me last night when I was watching this, maybe especially as a Canadian, that it's just always so funny to me how, like, and this was on Biden was talking about, like, my administration's going to do this and it's going to do this, and I always just find that rhetoric in all these American debates about the president being the one who has a plan for like these complicated legislative questions, and I'm like, why are they making promises? Like, he's the executive branch. It's like, okay, like maybe if you win the House and the Senate, you can maybe do some of that stuff. But like, it's just weird. Like, from the beginning, the whole way that these debates are framed are premised on like this false idea that the president is like the one who's going to get to do this stuff. And like, as a Canadian, I'm like, yeah, when we watch our prime ministers debate, like if they win, they actually could do that stuff, right? Because they have all the seats. Like, they can do whatever they want if they win. So it's just like funny to me that in America, they still have the debate as if that's true. But like, it's never been true. It's like, okay, maybe if you win the House and the Senate and you have a supermajority in the Senate, then maybe you can do that stuff.
Separation of powers and shit.
So it's just like weird. It's I don't know. It's like what, like, and I noticed, and this is not even the fault of the candidates, but like the journalists who are asking the questions. Like, I think there was a question yesterday about the opioid crisis, and it's like, what are you going to do to help solve the opioid crisis? Right? It's like, what? And it's like, what is the president going to do about that? It's like, he can make a couple executive orders, I guess, but it's like he needs to pass some complicated legislation. I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe there's like border enforcement stuff that he could do. I don't know, for like drugs getting into the state. I have no idea, but it's just, I don't know. That's not really about what you were saying. It was just something that really struck me.
You got my ears pricking up whenever you say we act as if it's true, although it's never been true, which is like,
it's never been true.
What are you going to do about the economy? They don't control there's not a big computer with economy buttons that's like grow, stop. These presidential decisions don't affect that, especially the most recent president. These are long-term contingent decisions, usually made by the real puppet masters. We could discuss that, but if you want the real version of the president myth, it's first of all that the president has all this power that they don't. They arguably have more power in, what do you call our system? Parliamentary democracies?
Yeah, parliamentary democracy, specifically Westminster style. I mean, you're right. Some of that stuff's even true of our system, right? Like global economic stuff's like, even the prime minister like doesn't have power over that, but at least they can pass whatever bills they want, right? But whereas a president can.
Besides the executive order thing, that's presidential.
But of course, the Washington Post saying truth lost this debate.
Yeah.
They believe that West Wing was a documentary, like the Aaron Sorkin show. And if you turn back to 90s, this is what I was doing in my research for the episode. 90s depictions of presidents. They're never 80 years old. They're usually like 60 years old. But they're competent, truthful, they're willing to make the right sacrifice for the good of the country, kind of paternal and reasonable person. This is the myth of the president that's been destroyed. I watched Armageddon because I was in an Airbnb that didn't have Wi-Fi, and I think we should watch Armageddon for a movie episode, because it's just rife with ideology from beginning to end.
It's incredible. I know. I saw it like not super recently, but recently enough to know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, two age-addled millionaires is not something that's new here. What is new is how old they are, I guess, combined age of 159, and having
Yeah.
this CNN moderated debate early because the Democrats wanted to, and then they put Joe Biden out there, who's like completely incoherent and can barely keep a train of thought or finish a sentence. I mean, I don't want to sensationalize this. The fallout from this is extreme, right? Like Democrats
Maybe maybe
are
maybe I had low expectations, but he did better than I thought.
Democrats are panicking, right? Like the Fox News coverage was just like, look at MSNBC, look at CNN. Like they're freaking out. And apparently, Democrats' phones were blowing up with donors saying, they're concerned about Biden's health and what happened during this debate. So like the fallout of this debate seems to be extreme. It's blown up in the Democrats' faces. But I don't want to sensationalize any of this because these are, establishment media and establishment parties doing their little circus. But I mean, it's becoming a bit of a farce. I mean,
I have a feeling though
huge
that you
farce.
are right about it in this case, because I want to take the response and be like, no, this is just what American democracy has always been. But I think this might be a little bit more than that, because there's no possible spin. You cannot just tell people the thing you just saw on your TV that we always tell you is like your channel to the truth is your television set. That thing was not what you thought it was. It's going to be this other thing. So, what's the conspiracy here? Like, do they want to lose? Do they want to like quickly switch the candidates in the last month so they don't have to do primaries? I don't know what the strategy here is, or if it's just a grandiose display of awful decision making.
Just like arrogance on Biden's
Just
part too.
terrible decision.
I mean, it seems to me, I always think that the explanation is like so mundane and boring. And like to me, the best explanation is just like laziness and like institutional path dependency. It's just like, okay, this is the way the Democratic Party works. He won, and it's like no one wants to do anything, and like everyone's a coward too. They're all risk averse. It's like no one in like a significant leadership position wants to take the chance of like publicly coming out and being like Biden needs to step down because like they think that it might fuck up their career. Like because everyone is thinking about their next spot in line in the Democratic Party, right? They're all thinking about like, oh, how am I going to work my way up this like establishment bureaucracy? And it's like the one who comes out and says like, oh, like fuck this guy, get him out of there. It's like there's a good chance that all the other people around who are like Biden, they're like, oh, it's not your turn. Like you can't just like say that. So then they don't. So it's cowardice and laziness. Like that, I think is like the best explanation for.
Well, yeah,
a
they're
lot of these
careerists.
things.
They're
Yeah.
worried about their post-political careers, and they'll get put on the boards of directors and get like nice
Exactly.
paychecks and corporations. So they're not going to go against the party line, even though there's clearly a huge fucking problem, which is Joe Biden is completely incompetent. And they did a pretty good job of, remember when the Joe Biden is like kind of has dementia stuff cropped up a while back. They did a pretty good job of, sort of keep sweeping that under the rug. Here it's come back now with a vengeance.
Yeah.
And then there's Trump just sort of parroting his
Being the same.
basic lines. Yeah, like immigration, fear mongering, climate change isn't real. We were robbed. Inflation's killing us.
Doesn't it look like he hasn't aged at all since like 4 years ago?
Yeah, he's got like the one ring on or something. He's just going and going.
He seems the same to me. He just seems totally the same. He was actually like, if anything, maybe like slightly like more measured. Like as measured as a Trump can be. Just like a little bit slower in the way that he speaks. Maybe that's his age.
You have no alternative on the left. They killed the Sanders campaign, which was like somewhat leftist. Okay, cool. Socialism. They stamped that out and they just fucking put Biden back up again.
He did steal a Sanders line and said that he was going to raise tax to the top earners or on unearned income. I didn't really understand what he was saying, but bitch, you've been president for 4 years.
The rich. Yeah, you've had ample opportunities to, raise the taxes from whatever he said, 24, 25%.
But did he though? Because you need the
never
House and the
did.
Senate. but you need
And
the House and the
now
Senate.
he's just, he
Can't do that
saved
on his
that
own.
as a talking point for this moment, apparently, so he could try to get reelected.
But that's exactly my point. Like, even if he wanted to, he can't. He's the executive branch. That's a legislative question. That's why, like, this whole idea of like, why didn't he do this thing is kind of moot. It's like, you don't
The
understand
party
way
and the donors are stacked with those very people who he's threatening to tax. They don't believe he's going to do it, or they wouldn't be fucking propping him up.
So like the cynical reading is like, because he knows that he can't do it, so he can just say that he's going to do it, and then when he can't do it, he'll just be like, well, I don't have the House and the Senate, right?
Yeah, exactly. We had something similar happen recently in Canada. Like Trudeau introduced like a higher capital gains tax for people who make over $250,000. And all the lobbyist class kind of just smiled and said, this new aiming at like money influence and lobbying influence on politics is just a kind of a rhetorical maneuver. It's not real.
Yeah.
So again, Eric, you got my ears pricking up. It's not real. It's staged. It's scripted. It's a bit of theater for us to enjoy. So, I think there's nothing to do except to cast this in quasi-religious terms, ritualistic terms, because what you get articulated is that, again, pretty much everybody knows that this isn't real. You shouldn't expect anything to come out of promises like that. And if you go down to the local bar and talk to Mr. Joe sitting there 3 beers in, he knows it too. And he's going to say the same thing that you did. They're all puppets. The money in the shadows is pulling the strings.
He knows it too.
But that knowledge and whatever's true about it doesn't bear on participation, which is somehow mandatory. We're participating in it right now, and we don't even live in the country. So it's a weird split collective psyche to have this be the most important thing, and this at the same time, despite knowing full well that we're watching a TV show. Now, the Washington Post columnist knows this better than anyone, and he can still write, "Let us take a moment to mourn the truth that died just yesterday. It was alive and well in presidential debates until yesterday." Like, what is that?
And also, like, the only way I would amend that is just say there's no someone out there. Like, that's the fucking depressing part. There's no someone out there controlling it. It's like a whole bunch of interconnected forces that are it's like a puppet master with no puppeteer. It's just like a bunch of strings pulling us because like of these interrelated forces, right? Like, so I just think like saying someone makes it sound too conspiratorial. It's not even. It's actually scarier than that, because it's just like a whole mishmash of institutional like path dependency and like and yeah, of course there's a couple people or like groups that have like more pull on the strings than others, but it's not centralized, right? It's not centralized.
It's like a bunch of puppeteers and all their strings are tangled up, and you don't really know what you're pulling sometimes when you pull a string, but generally it all pulls in the direction of the wealthy and the military industrial complex and all that shit. But there's no like precise way to manipulate it. You're right. Yeah, it's just networks of funding and influence that all kind of work in the same direction. But yeah,
that's a good visual example. Instead of a puppeteer with these nice strings that each pull an arm, it's a giant tangled mass.
And there's a web.
A whole bunch of people pulling on a mass, and hopefully it slides the Overton window, which is true. And we're going to look at the names of some of those puppeteers today, going back to the 70s.
Nice.
Before we go there, our solution. Have a lottery to pick the new Democratic nominee for president. Aristotle was the first to point it out. Elections are always going to tend towards oligarchy, but chance is democratic.
Exactly. Democratic by D20.
Yeah, if you're into reformism, sure.
We are D20 Democrats.
Let's fix capitalism, boys.
We're coining the term, or we coined the term in the last episode, D20, which I love. You coined it.
Radical reformism, D20 democracy.
It's great. It's a great nerd reference.
I may have coined the term, but you brought up sortition like 3 years ago.
That's the plan. See, that's the thing. Like, these anarchist activists, they should be fighting for something concrete, and that should be D20 democracy.
I was reading a bunch of Hegel. This is me showing my cards a little bit. I was going to try to frame Hegel for everything that's wrong in the world, and I couldn't do it. In good conscience, no. I can't do it. It was close. It was close enough, but we're gonna blame Leo Strauss instead.
And that's even questionable.
Listen, this is what we're gonna try to do. We were gonna try to do something really naughty. Ooh, spank me. We were gonna try to do historical idealism of the right wing, which is to suggest that the events of history can be explained by the ideas that people have at a time rather than the messy, complicated, and sometimes imperceptible material conditions of a time. And we were gonna test the hypothesis that America's Overton window has gone so far right because of a conspiracy of ideas, which is the fault of acolytes of one Leo Strauss. And the reason we were going to do this is because this is about 15 years ago or so, but Leo Strauss was the liberal intellectuals' scary boogeyman back then, post-Bush. And I haven't heard much about him lately. I guess the liberal intellectuals have given up on that thesis.
Well, there's no Straussians left, or like they're a dying breed.
Yeah, maybe he's just not as relevant. They've got new stuff now, like turning to classical liberal, neoliberal economists.
I mean, that's even a little passé now.
What about Claremont, though?
I don't know, that UFC guy like announced that everyone should read von Mises after he won a match a little while ago. I forget the guy's name.
Von Mises is not Straussianism, though. Von Mises is like right-wing economics.
No, that's the neoliberal free market shit.
Yeah.
And the free market economics is something that this neoconservative movement is all about. And I'd say free market economics is still a kind of consensus today. So
sure,
I mean,
I don't know if that has much to do with Strauss,
there.
though.
No, I don't think that's the question, really. Yeah.
We were gonna try to frame Hegel. I don't think it's gonna work. We were gonna try to frame Leo Strauss, and I also don't think that's gonna work. But we can explain to you at least some of what people were saying about Leo Strauss, and by extension Hegel. He's not really a Hegelian, but anyway, what we discovered is there's not really any ideas of note in American politics, at least in terms of sufficient reason. It's hard to draw any causal connection, and I was trying, but it's hard to draw any causal connections when it's almost always a case of some union of business leaders, networks of business leaders giving money to things that benefit them, and those things producing ideas downstream that defend those business people from the government. And there's really no causality more profound than that. That's just what happens for the last 100 years.
You know,
another way to frame it too is that this is culture wars stuff, right? Like Leo Strauss got, recruited into the culture wars that began, I guess, post 60s, right? Like just like today, culture wars goes on with ideas from Nietzsche and ideas from Heidegger and Dugin. And like all these sorts of different figures get folded into this culture wars. And Leo Strauss is like one of the early figures whose ideas get recruited into this. And whatever Leo Strauss himself sort of did and thought and like wrote, like these neoconservatives wrote in popular publications as well as being influential in politics. And so their public facing side was this war of ideas, this culture wars, this idealist bullshit, which we're all supposed to sort of fight in and try to fight for our side of the culture wars as if that's going to make any fucking difference at all.
Yeah. Well, the one reason why, though, I think in the mid 2000s, this like idea that Straussianism is like influencing the Bush administration is just because there was a couple people high level in the Bush administration who were famously students of Alan Bloom, specifically, who was like Strauss's kind of main disciple. Most notably Paul Wolfowitz, who I think was like Assistant Secretary of Defense, and he was like a student, and apparently would talk to Bloom all the time, like during the Bush administration. And there's actually a novelization of Alan Bloom's life by that famous, actually I think he's a Canadian writer who was at the University of Chicago. And it was like a novelization of kind of Bloom's life, and it was very controversial. So it was about Bloom, but the novelist wrote a different name for Bloom. So it was kind of like a thinly veiled kind of like description of his life with a different name.
Do you remember the title?
Controversial because I'll need to Google it. But what was controversial about it was that it kind of revealed like Alan Bloom's like homosexual like life, that he was actually like a closeted homosexual. Well, not really closeted, but just like unacknowledged.
Quietly.
Yeah, quietly. And the reason why, and so in that book though, what's funny is like there's like it kind of recounts scenes of Bloom taking calls from someone high level in the Bush administration, like during that time, and that's kind of known to be Paul Wolfowitz.
Yeah, I think Leo Strauss's ideas were borrowed when they matched up with what neoconservatives were selling, which was things like, American exceptionalism, aggressive foreign policy, and American interventionism, cultural elitism, intellectualized culture wars. And Strauss was a resource to draw on for these things, right? Like William Crystal, one of the big neocons who wrote for Rupert Murdoch's, what was it called? The Weekly Standard. And he was an advisor to the Vice President Dan Quayle, very influential. He drew on Strauss's ideas, for instance.
Okay, so that novel about Alan Bloom is by Saul Bellow. It's called Ravelstein.
Oh, Saul Bellow. Like, he was his friend, right?
Yeah, they were very close friends at the University of Chicago. And Saul Bellow is Canadian, born in Quebec.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I was intentionally trying, like I said, to make some connection between Hegel's philosophy of right via Leo Strauss, and then Leo Strauss's kind of ideas about what the current state should be. But this current state, if we're talking about the debate yesterday, I'm pretty sure this would be really offensive to both Hegel and Strauss. Because Strauss is
an elitist.
Yeah, as best as that's kind of his, and this is true, right? I was reading him today. Leo Strauss, as best as I can tell, he does not trust democracy. And what we have right now is not democracy. I don't think he would call it that. But even if we did, it's a theoretical democracy. He thinks that this is not going to work, and you do need some sort of cloister of philosophers who are in the know. They know the secret. And this is something that, like, it's in Hegel. It's not an emphasis in Hegel, but it's not difficult to find it in there, that to have rationality throughout the society, the state, then you have philosophers who are in the know, and then there's sort of a trickle-down method. If they are in the university, then the people that interact with ordinary people, like the clergy, they're going to go up. They're going to go to the universities to get educated, and there they're going to get some Hegelian mixed up in their religion, which is a good thing, and then the Hegelianism that's mixed into Christianity will go down to the dumb people, and it gets dumb, but still there's like a rationality through the state that gets even to the dumbest individuals. So what we're witnessing with, let's take the death of truth seriously, as if it died yesterday. Hegel and Strauss, I think, would agree that that's bullshit, because the truth was never in public in the first place. That's the last place you should look for an idea. You should look to philosophy for an idea. So as long as we can have something like a coherent history of ideas, the record of philosophy, truth will be okay. And even if there are backsliding accidents, moments like this, those ultimately aren't going to amount to real historical events.
Well, and also for Strauss, I think his emphasis on the ancients, right? Like Straussians love to dwell with the ancients, right? So I think, you could see them as, in many cases, a kind of Platonist a little bit.
An aristocrat.
But it's important also, like, that they're worried about tyranny too. So, like, I know one of Leo Strauss's famous books is like on tyranny. So it's like, yeah, they don't like democracy, they don't like tyranny either. But it's like, I would say, like, to some extent, it's like, okay, how do you have the balance between, like, the necessity of, like, protecting ordinary citizens from things they can't handle, right? Like certain truths that the public can't handle, while also, like, not letting the knowledge holders become tyrants, right? And it's like, and I think that to some extent, the Straussian project, as far as I can understand it, is like concerned with identifying that balance, right? And it's like, because you need to, because people can't handle, And that's why I think like in his Persecution and the Art of Writing, which maybe we'll read in another episode, and I think like is this idea that like Straussians talk about how there's an esoteric meaning of the text because if you come out and say true things, like the public can't handle it, and then like a mob, they'll just like murder the people who are the truth tellers, right? Which is why they killed Plato, or killed Socrates rather, right? Because it's like he was saying things that made the public uncomfortable and they can't handle it, so like they kill him. So it's like you need to so like you kind of conceal these truths esoterically in the text, because, and that's kind of like where the sort of elitism, and like where if any listeners have been in a university where there's a Straussian professor, you'll have like the group of Straussians who go and do their secret reading groups and go and read the text because they want to try to identify those esoteric truths in the text.
They drink they drink wine on mahogany desks because they're so refined.
Literally.
They view themselves as the cultural elites, and they use their influence to spread these ideas, right? Like today, we have, the right-wing attacks on critical race theory and concern about education and the university and schooling systems, right? Like that same kind of concern, that same war of ideas over those things and what we should promote in education, what we should teach people. These have roots in this movement, right? Like, another guy from the University of Chicago, maybe the person you were talking about knows him, Robert Maynard Hutchins, founding the Great Books program. The best education, he says, for the best is the best education for all. And as Strauss wrote, liberal education is the necessary endeavor to find an aristocracy within democratic mass society, right? So again, that these cultural elites who think they know best, and they're going to influence politicians and politics and general ideology to accord with their views, is that, they need to, say, create an education system that promotes these ideas, liberal education, and for instance, right? And this privileged minority who stands above the rest as the guiding light.
Yeah, and if listeners might remember that, I think, did we do an episode on the closing of the American mind, or maybe we talked about doing it but never did it?
I think we did.
Okay, so like in that one, that's Alan Bloom, right? Leo Strauss's kind of main disciple, and in that book, he's kind of in the 90s talking about the growth of relativism on college campuses, right? And it's exactly for the reason that Eric's talking about, that it's like concern that it's going to be
corrupting the youth.
Corrupting also like the values of liberal education, right?
Because American values, traditional values, an elitist liberal education as opposed to a more democratic.
But Leo Strauss is hard to pin down though, because like in the sense that it's not simply like these kind of crude American values. It is really like, I would even say like transcending an American centrism to just like a broader view of just like Western, like a kind of Western elitism or something, whatever that means. Because I mean, he is American, but I wouldn't put like, I think it would be like a misreading to be like, oh, this is like Leo Strauss himself is specifically interested in like a specifically American kind of elite. I mean, I guess he kind of is, but
yeah, like look another quote from Strauss in the early 60s. We must not expect that liberal education can ever become universal education. It will always remain the obligation and the privilege of a minority. So again.
And you can also see this in practice with, these little colleges, American colleges that do the liberal arts, and they pump out people like Tucker Carlson and Jesse Waters, who they are in the know. They're kind of acting as clowns, but they secretly know, what the real game is. And I did want to stress, there's a case to be made that this is Hegelian in structure a little bit, but it doesn't really jive with what Hegel actually said, because there's not like an elite class that is supposed to be the secret possessors of this knowledge. It's more that most people just won't get it. So you need a general will to be mediated by basically indifferent decision makers. You have specialists, but you can't let the specialists also make the decisions, which is why you need something like a Protestant monarch who has a better idea of freedom.
Well, yeah,
and the freedom is going to trickle down.
Yeah, what we're dealing with isn't, you know, what Hegel meant, what Hegel really meant, what like a real good interpretation of Hegel's ideas would lead to if we could like get it right and put it into practice. No, it's the same thing with Strauss. We're dealing with these right wingers, this group of people, and their, you know, first of all, their formative experiences in their life and what they like and hate. And then we're dealing with their interpretations of these figures, their appropriation of their ideas, and they having the influence that they had, you know, using these ideas. Maybe even they already believed these ideas and then they just sort of found them confirmed, you know, right wing Hegelianism, kind of neoconservative appropriation of Leo Strauss. And they use these ideas to promote their perspective. Whether or not the ideas convince them of it, whether or not they interpret these figures correctly, we're dealing with a kind of history of ideas here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And they also have this weird way of reading. It's they say it's close reading, but it's trying to find secrets in the text that are written to the smart readers. So they might say something. I haven't done my research on this front, but I can see a Straussian saying something about Hegel, like, oh, he has all this language of universal freedom and language of the state and language of the prince, but he doesn't mean any of this. And if you read Hegel properly, he's actually speaking to his few acolytes, the few that will understand him. So I don't know that they did that with respect to Hegel, but they do it with respect to people like Plato and Machiavelli and Hobbes.
I do think it's interesting though, because I do feel like Trumpism has kind of complicated this narrative a little bit because like, I don't think that, you know, these Straussian elitists are like happy about Trump. Like,
No,
like, I don't think that they like, I mean, I think that maybe some of them are like, okay, well, maybe we can use this guy. And it's true that apparently like the West Coast Straussians, like the ones who are at like, what's that place called?
the Claremont Institute.
The Claremont Institute. Yeah, so like those guys kind of like Trump a little bit.
There's a question.
I don't know how to put the pieces together. There's just like a question about like, does he really, you know, maybe he's just like useful.
He's too much of the id. Like if you have the Platonic structure, the head rules the belly through the chest. You have thumos and whatever the appetites. Trump is too much of the appetites, and the Straussians, who I guess thought they were pulling the strings or think they can pull the strings, that you can't control a force of nature. Basically, it's Trump is the return of the repressed nature of people. So on one hand, the liberals will hand wring that Trump is destroying democracy, but I think the Straussians' fear here, or the neocon fear, would be that he actually starts to believe that he can change things. And through Trump, his base or the Republican base will get charged up enough to actually expect him to start changing stuff about how politics works. They might expect him to actually drain the swamp, which would be fatal for conservative think tanks and warmongers who consider themselves to be this secret class of influential chess-playing masters. Now, I think they've probably seen him in that might have been the case the first time around, but having seen him in action, I think they know that the status quo is not going to be really actually disrupted except by rhetoric.
Well, there's a question, yes, as to whether Trump is a deviation or an intensification of certain aspects of the neoconservative line, right? Because neoconservatism, I would argue, well, because of what we read, it's a little dated, but neoconservatism was influential, at least up until George Bush Jr., right? Mm-hmm. Major people in that party and supporting that party were in the neoconservative camp and other right-wing groups as well, but neoconservatism the focus. I would think that neoconservatism hasn't died, that it's alive and well, but that question to whether Trump is a deviation from that, or, I mean, that's an interesting question. Maybe he's an intensification of certain elements. I would at least argue that neoconservatism prepared the way for this more extreme Trumpism, which is more extreme in various ways. And is it a complete divergence? I don't know. Maybe not.
I kind of think that there's always, like, because the political system, as much as it's you know, like very distantly a democracy, it means that, you know, you have the people in the Republican Party who are trying to like put their candidates forward. But then every once in a while, like because of the way that the primary system works in the Republican Party, like the people will just decide to pick someone that like the elites don't want, right? And this very much happened with Trump, right? Like very much no one in the Republican Party at the beginning wanted Trump to win. Everyone was like hoping that he would leave. No one wanted to deal with him. Unfortunately, and it's kind of interesting.
Then when they saw which way the wind was blowing,
Well,
they
I have
jumped on board.
in my department, we had this political theorist, Ian Shapiro, from Yale University, come and visit, and he kind of gave this really interesting talk about like he was basically arguing that in America, like there's too much democracy in the party systems, meaning that like the primary system where like regular people can go to the primaries and vote, it encourages the fringe people because like only the radicals go, like, right, like kind of like ordinary, I guess, sort of like centrist or people who are kind of like disengaged from politics, they don't go to the primaries, right? They don't vote. So then what happens is it ends up encouraging a potential like a Trump to happen, right? So it's kind of funny. I mean, paradoxically, he's just like, yeah, like there's too much democracy in the party system because if there wasn't democracy and the party elites got to choose, then Trump would have never had a chance, right? To actually win. But because we actually left it to the people, then it gets disrupted because you have all the radicals, the activists who go and are like, yeah, fuck the system. Let's get Trump in there. You know, so I think like when you have a system like that, there's just always a chance that you're going to get this curveball, which was Trump. But then, yeah, they take advantage of it. They try to use him as best as they can. And I was just kind of reading right now to connect it back to Straussianism, that there is, I guess, like a through line in Straussianism, which kind of corrects something that I said in the past, which is like an American exceptionalism, right? So like I think within Straussianism, there is an idea that like only America is like the perfect place for this kind of liberal education to happen that can kind of mold this like right balanced elite who are not tyrants, but are also, you know, elite and understand truths better than most of the public. And since Trump,
big time.
Yeah,
it's supposed to be something we haven't mentioned. It's a meritocracy.
Yeah, it's supposed to be,
but it's this secret meritocracy where the smart people won't show their hands. They'll just be able to control everything. Exactly.
And the American liberal arts education is like the perfect way of determining that on their view. But now since Trump, there's been a disagreement between what we call the East Coast Straussians and the West Coast Straussians. So the West Coast at Claremont, they're more radical, and then the East Coast Straussians are more traditional, and they don't like Trump. So like the East Coast Straussians by and large are like, you know, they think that Trump is a threat to the American institutions that they think make America like the right place with the right balance to like kind of create this meritocracy. And the kind of more radical West Coast Straussians are like, well, maybe these institutions do need to be remade, and Trump is maybe the perfect battering ram to kind of like destroy them and recreate them in a new way. So, okay, that's like an overall summary, I think.
I like what Pills kind of just said about Trump being kind of the return of the repressed masses there, because it's kind of the exception that proves the rule against what you were just saying about there being too much democracy, right? Like there has not been democracy, real democracy, for so fucking long. And people are extremely dissatisfied.
Well, what do you mean by democracy?
Well, I mean, you get these two political parties and they choose these carefully curated fucking candidates. They smash out whoever they don't like Bernie Sanders, and they tried to do the same with Trump, right? But Trump kind of was the exception that proved the rule. He managed to mobilize such strong popular support that it actually broke that sort of normality.
But just on this question of democracy, though, like I think it's, you know, I think there's like two ways of thinking about it, or well, more than just two, but at least in this context, because like I agree with you that like in the society, in the broader American, like there's maybe not enough democracy. But I was just talking, and that political theorist I was talking about was just talking narrowly about like the way the parties govern themselves, right? And he was like trying to explain like why did we get this Trump, right? And he was like, well, in other countries in Europe and stuff, there's not so much internal democracy in the parties. And like that creates an opportunity. And also it's important
that couldn't happen here, for example, because our parties are so structured that any candidate has to spend basically their entire life kissing the ass of the party brass to work their way up. It's the reason our politics are so boring.
Yeah, it's important. Yeah, we don't really have that. It's also important to distinguish between the Republican and the Democratic Party. And this is kind of interesting because to some extent, the Democratic Party is actually organized to be less democratic than the Republican Party. Because like in the Democratic Party, they have this thing called super delegates, which like when the delegates are voting for the nominee, you have these unelected delegates, these super delegates who have a bunch of votes, so they can like move things in a direction that are like outside of what the public vote. And that's why like Hillary Clinton got like a bunch of super delegates, right? That weren't actually from the voting. So whereas the Republican Party doesn't have that system. So like in the Republican Party, it was free reign, and then they could bring in Trump. Whereas in the Democratic Party, it was actually a lot harder to get Bernie Sanders in there because they have like a less democratic system. So it's kind of like the party with more democracy is like the party that you want to have less democracy. And the party that has like less democracy is the one that we would wish would have more democracy.
It's kind of like this internal control. I don't know if I call it democracy, but yeah. Anyway, it's like you don't get to choose what's on the menu. You just get like these two menus and you look at the items that are on both of them and then you vote. And you're like, wait, who chose these items? Did we, the people, choose them? Were they put up for vote? No, like they came up with them internally and then presented to them, to us. Carefully curated ideological options that are not really much different.
But that's what Victor's saying, that the Republican Party has less of that than the Democratic Party.
Yeah, because literally in the Republican Party, anyone can run for the primary, right? And then like the question there is like has to do with the citizens, right? Who's going to turn out? Who's going to go to the primary and vote, right? Anyone can do it. Right? Anyone can go, but who's actually going to take the time to go to the primaries? And this guy's argument was, well, it's the political radicals.
The psychos.
Right? It's the one who care, the psychos, right?
Well,
they're the ones who are going to show up.
That probably ignores the money aspect too. Not anyone can vote. Any like person with millions of dollars and tons
anyone
of
who's
support.
a member. No, anyone who's a member of the Republican Party can go to a Republican primary and vote. That's the way the system works.
It's a money thing in the end, I think.
But the money thing failed with Trump, right? Because the money people didn't want Trump to win initially.
Well, I mean, Trump himself is very wealthy. That's
yes,
what
I agree.
mean.
He has a lot of money, but my point is like ultimately, like unlike here in the States, it's like very much a thing. They always talk about being a registered Republican or a registered Democrat or a registered Independent, right? Like everyone, like almost everyone is. Whereas here, it's like who the hell's actually a member of the Liberal Party, right? It's like probably like tens of thousands of people. In the States, it's like most people are registered as something, and then with your registration, you can go to a primary and vote. I'm not saying that money doesn't influence it, but it's also just true that in this party system, anyone who's a registered Republican can show up to the primaries. And the point is who's going to show up to the primaries, right? And it's more likely to be crazy people who are like political, like who are obsessed with politics, who think about politics all the time, right? And those people are more likely to vote for a crazy person.
And then we shouldn't forget about our gerrymandering and our voter suppression and all that.
Those are separate issues, which I agree with.
But there's still so many ways of subverting that democracy. And I think it's,
let's talk about the money for a second, because we read this book. This is our kind of kickoff point, which was The Politics of Fear, How Republicans Use Money, Race, and the Media to Win. And it's a bit dated because it's from 2006.
Mm-hmm. Very much a Bush era book.
Oh, yeah. But The Politics of Fear is just to say that en masse, the elites can treat people as just the dumbest herd animals. And I have a question about this because it seems strange, but always correct. So you make them, the Republicans, this book argues, only has any popular support by fear, by making people afraid of first communists, then black people, then sexual libertines in the 60s, then Muslims, and now
women's
it's
rights and abortion, and
now it's woke.
Yeah,
now it's woke. Well, it's immigrants, right?
Immigrants,
terrorism, war on drugs.
Trump mentioned like immigrants like 30 times yesterday. And the thing is,
politics of fear. There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah, there you go. But I wanted to consider this because the electorate falls for this seemingly with no resistance, which is not what you'd expect if you just finished reading a liberal political theorist like, I don't know, John Rawls, for example. But as the book outlines it, and I found this really worth considering, is that fear is an item available for purchase here. And there's nearly a one-to-one correspondence between dollars, pumping them into a variety of systems, and just getting fear as the product out the other side. So you can exchange dollars for racism, or you can just buy xenophobia in a nice little package right off the shelf. And this is perhaps, if the book is to be believed, the only Republican strategy for winning for the last 60 years. And I'd really like us to put on our philosophy pants here and ask, what does that really mean? Because given what we know about individuals, or maybe given what we know about groups, given what we know about ideas, it's striking to put it in these terms that fear is an object available for purchase. Isn't it? Am I onto anything here?
Yeah. And then you can tap this network of media to promote that fear, and then you can see the results in concrete policy. So you could just buy the politics you like, and the fear tactics are the very effective source of the new right's influence.
Totally. And like, regard. Actually, doesn't this point actually, I think in a way, like beautifully just kind of explains what I was just saying before, right? Because like, what did Trump do? Trump out-feared the Republican establishment, right? He came out and turned the fear up to a maximum that was even higher than the fear that like the Republican elite at the time was serving, right?
Yeah, they tap in. I mean, what the conservatives have always been good at doing, this new right, is tapping into popular sentiment like that, popular fears, popular insecurities.
Exactly.
And Trump did that. Like, you're right. Yeah, he sort of outdid the establishment Republicans in that regard. And his pre-existing popularity definitely kind of gave him a boost, and his wealth definitely. But he ultimately tapped into that fear, because why didn't somebody else do that? No, Trump was the man for the job because he's a nut job, but also a canny nut job.
But he also said it in the way that people think it.
His mannerisms.
So, if we can drill down to this, I wanted to focus, because this seems really weird, right? You can buy fear, which means there's an economy of fear. So the economy of fear, it can't be simply you show people stuff on TV and then they're afraid of it, right? There has to be some sort of complicity, obviously. But what is it, especially comparing the political theories of Hegel and the political theories of Leo Strauss, that there's like this underlying rationality, at least at the top, but then at the bottom, rationality kind of disperses, and then we are completely among the appetites, which is something Plato said. The stomach needs to be controlled by the mind and all that stuff. But what is it to say you can just make people afraid? Is it simply with images? And then you kept using the term, for example, they're tapping into fears. Are they tapping into fears, or is this like a production cycle of fear?
No, they're not creating the fears. No, the fears are part of a broader climate of fear, right? Like the Red Scare, McCarthyism, anti-communism. Like that was the main early phase of the fear, stoking people's fears. And, Stalin didn't do anything to fucking help this or reassure people that communism's not a nasty boogeyman. But whatever its source, they can use that fear. And then the next phase was the 60s, right? The rise of the new left, civil rights movements, all that stuff. And partially the Vietnam War in the background. All those provide the climate in which, you can put up your fearful lightning rods and harness that fear and shock the public with that fear into sort of doing what you want, which was a successful thing.
I do want to know the source, though, because we're brushing up against something that you can't say on a critical theory podcast, which is this just human nature? Is this what's happening?
I was going to say.
No, it's not. It's the climate of fear. It's you look at the conditions of history, you look at what's going on in history, people's fears aren't all fake, but they can be used to political purposes, right? Like the economic downturn that America experienced in the 70s was another source of insecurity, right? And you can use that. There's opportunism here. That's what it's to say. We shouldn't look for a source. I mean, we should, but we shouldn't look for it in the Republicans or the neoconservatives. The source comes from outside of them, but they use it. They're opportunistic. They're reactionary, right? They stoke fears. They don't, light the fires that the fears are blazing from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point that Pills was alluding to there about like human nature. I mean, of course, it's not so much that like, you know, human beings are doomed to be afraid in a particular way. Those fears can be molded and manipulated in all kinds of ways. The point is more though that like we are the type of creature that, I don't know, maybe to give it like a psychoanalytic spin, like loves being afraid, like loves finding an object to like point to and be like, that's the source of my problems. That's the source of like the reasons why life isn't going my way, right? So like if we weren't that kind of creature, right, then these things wouldn't work, right? Like you know, buying fear wouldn't work, but like because we happen to be the kind of creature that, you know, is you know, liable to get afraid of things and like in a way like sort of you know, almost treat our object of fear as a kind of reversed object of desire, kind of get fixated on it, right? And I think that happens, you know,
Yeah, object of repulsion.
not to like put a moral equivalency on it at all, but that happens on the left too, right? I mean, all the rhetoric about like fascism, and some of it might be justified, but it's like the way the preoccupation with it, right? In a way that it kind of it can sometimes even emerge in a almost quasi compulsive obsession, right? That it's like, you know,
Yeah.
so this is telling us something about human nature, right? Even if it's not like a deterministic view of human nature in the sense that like we will always be afraid in this particular way. It's obviously open to contingency and open to manipulation, but the fact that we are that type of creature is relevant.
This is exactly where I was hoping we'd go, because if it's true, then, you know, Plato and Leo Strauss are kind of right.
Yeah.
If humans, if human society, like the mass, if the mass is the kind of thing that you can like a vending machine where you put a few dollars in and then you make them afraid of the thing that you want them to be afraid of, and then you can get them to support things that are demonstrably contrary to their interests, then, you know, we might be Platonists or Straussian.
Well, no, we're not. Yes. I mean, on a basic level, fear is a powerful emotion, and you can use fear to manipulate people. But also, you know, altruism is another very powerful human tendency. And we can build a society, we can build a politics by appealing to altruistic sentiment in people, or we can build a politics based on fear and manipulation, right?
Before you game that out, do you have examples of the former?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not saying I agree or like want to return to this kind of politics, but I think some of the earlier 20th century politics wasn't firmly grounded in fear, right? You have the welfare state, you have the New Deal politics, and even in the 60s, right? You have like President Lyndon Johnson trying to get elected on his The Great Society and the war on poverty, right? And those are appealing to like altruistic things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even the New Left, right? Altruistic things. We need to eliminate gender disparities. We need to eliminate income disparities. We need to protect the rights of racialized people, right? That's appealing. But then there's the appealing to fear. There's the war on terror, right? The war on drugs. Like you can also appeal to people's fears. And as they say in the introduction here, right? Republicans have dominated the ballot box since the time of Richard Nixon, not by appealing to voters' altruistic sentiments, as Democrats have done until recently, but rather by appealing to their worst instincts, particularly their fear of those different from themselves. Okay, so they're basically calling the American populace racist, which is a bit heavy-handed, but I do get the point about, you know, we're building a politics based on fear and manipulation rather than appealing to the better side, right? And then we come up, well, this is just human nature. No, human nature is not
Malleable.
a factor here. Human nature goes in all kinds of different directions. Humans don't have a nature, really. No, we've built this society, and we built it in a way that, you know, fear is the main tool for manipulation. And if the Democrats are going to capitulate to that politics, which I think they have, then what are you going to do about it? You need to offer a real alternative. Like, you know, again, I don't think Bernie Sanders was a real alternative, but he tried to bring the altruistic appeal back a little bit. We saw a little glimmer of it with Bernie Sanders, and it can come back, but you know, the establishment is doing everything it can not to let that come back because that would be bad for business, right? And this is a pro-business country.
We can have a politics that's less focused on fear, but I think that there is also like an uncomfortable question, which is kind of actually related a little bit to my dissertation, which is just like, okay, like what kinds of emotions or let's say like dispositional attitudes are easier and which ones are harder, right? And like the easier ones are going to be easier to manipulate, right, than the harder ones. So like I think that there's, I think built in, since we're habitual creatures, there's a kind of status quo bias where like, we're kind of more likely to be resistant to change than we are like open to uncertain new things. And like, I think that puts us as like progressive minded, so like broadly socialist leaning people, it puts us at a disadvantage because like,
yeah, fear of the unknown.
We have to argue for something new, right? And that's harder to do because it's easier to be afraid of things that like you don't understand. And it's easier to be like, well, I'm fine with what exists already. And like, I don't want to change it. And like, so we're always going to be at a disadvantage.
Yeah, we have to say radical change is not scary, people. Radical change should not be scary. But yeah, it's too easy to make people afraid. Yeah.
It's so easy to make people afraid. So easy to make people afraid.
And it's cheap too.
Yeah.
It's cheap, yeah.
This kind of flies in the face of the liberal humanist desire for mass enlightenment. And Leo Strauss is kind of against that enlightenment. He's like, you can teach everybody, but most people aren't going to get it.
Well, there's that famous like kind of saying in American politics that like if you're explaining, you're losing. Right? It's like so like if you have to explain something, right, which is like yeah, like let's explain how a better world will be. Whereas like when you just like focus on people's emotions, you don't have to explain anything because they feel it. So if you're explaining, you're losing.
And they're like, shut up, nerd.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I was reading earlier this week. I brought in the human nature to be a little bit contentious, but I was reading Durkheim, and Durkheim's is like the primeval, the way that you create society at the most fundamental level is with faith rituals. And faith, or fear, I should say, is a kind of faith. It's a kind of faith that the future is going to be worse, which is very easy to exploit. But the closest you can get to human nature in this respect is to say that the only thing that people ever unify around is faith. And the flip side of faith is profane. The sacred and the profane is his term. So kind of what you're saying, we have these opposing angels and demons in this Manichaean sphere. But yeah, listening to the talking points from commentators and even the points that you guys are making, it seems like we have the road to heaven and the road to hell. And the road to hell, it's just easier. Now, to prod that a little, why is the road to hell the easier one? Why is it so simple to say the profane, first it's witches, then communists, then women, then blacks, then gays, then wokes, and then your kid's kindergarten teacher? And I really actually don't have an answer to that. But if human sociability is a spontaneous rather than a causal event, and if we are materialists, then I would guess that people who feel good about the present are less likely to fear the future. But it's also of a religious or ritualistic order that belief, faith, fear, that these things can be elicited almost as if from nothing. But to keep it from nothing in the religious sense, you need to create objects of the belief, which is why animist religions produce totems and symbolic objects, according to Durkheim. And then when I look at the questions that we opened up with, like, what is a debate like this for? What are the symbols for? Who is it for when we don't believe in it? How does it work so well when we know it's a stack of lies? So I kind of have to conclude from that we're weirdly religious and also fundamentally irrational animals. I don't see the Enlightenment on the horizon, and we got what we are.
Interesting.
I don't know. Sorry for the deviation. This is a bit of a deviation, but I don't really have your faith that it's like, oh, we just give positive goals instead of negative ones.
Well, I think, yeah, if religion is the main source of people's like what informs people's worldview, and not education, as the Straussians and the neocons want to remove education for the masses and keep it as like this elitist endeavor that's sort of just looking down and teaching people. Yeah, then religion. That's why religion is a huge element. Like the most popular elements of the new right have been and still are religious people, right? Catholics, evangelicals, and Protestant fundamentalists. Like that's the broad grassroots support comes from religion. So you get rid of liberal education and you allow religion to fill in the gaps, and then you kind of have this nice playbook for manipulating people again. Like Trump used the anti-abortion thing again on Biden yesterday, saying, "Oh, Biden's willing to eliminate babies after 9 months."
Yeah.
And Biden's like, "No, we're not for late term." Like it's the same fucking shit. These guys wrote the playbook for this. The neocons, I should say, are not part of the religious sect, but they are. That's why the right is like a broad coalition of different elements.
They use pastors and like what Jimmy Swaggart and Billy Graham came up in this book. They use them to stoke fears of an end time, or, you know, the sexual libertines that are taking over the country, or the wokes. The wokes are the new one.
Yeah, like the gay rights and abortion and all that. Yeah.
But what's more fundamental is this is not, in a Durkheim sense, it's not religion versus education. It's all religion. Every society is religion in this broad sense of maintaining a secret. And the Straussians, so I'd be interested in what our cult is if we ever want to touch on that. But the Straussian cult is to have this kind of secret that only you guys know, that's based on like a secret society, but an open-ish secret society, where they gather together and pull out the deep secrets of these books. Now, anyone can read these books. This is kind of fundamental to Straussianism and Alan Bloomianism. Anyone can pick up Plato's Republic and read it. But no one except the inside members of the cult are going to be able to understand that. So in this sense, I said we weren't going to conspiratorially blame everything on Leo Strauss, but there's definitely a cultic aspect to it. But if what I'm saying is true, there's a cultic aspect to all forms of knowledge.
I think it's just elitism. They just think that only they know. It's not like numerology where they have some kind of secret key. It's not like alchemy where it's like...
Funny you say that, because there's actually an article in that famous purple book, The History of Political Philosophy, edited by Alan Bloom and I think Leo Strauss, or maybe Kropsky. And there's an article in there, I think it's by Bloom, on Machiavelli's The Prince, and he goes through and starts doing numerology about like about the order of the chapters. And I forget exactly what the argument is, but literally he starts talking about like the numbers and like that there's a choice there, that Machiavelli's trying to tell us something with the numbers of the chapters.
Machiavelli is a threat to political philosophy because he gave up the secret. Like for Bloom, at least, exactly. Everybody knows that Machiavelli is true politics. Everyone who's ever had power knows that. But you weren't supposed to give up the game. You were supposed to have it written in code. So,
which is why Machiavelli calls Machiavelli the first modern. It's like the first modern philosopher because or the political theorist, because he gave up the secret. Exactly.
Yeah, the power politics secret.
The Washington Post doesn't believe Machiavelli. The Washington Post thinks that truth died yesterday.
And Machiavelli wrote The Prince or the Medicis in order to get let back in because he was in exile. Like, that's a complete distortion of intellectual history, first of all. Not that I care to defend Machiavelli, but I mean, even that interpretation is wacko.
Which one?
Like, oh, he like that Machiavelli somehow like let slide the secret to power politics. Like, that's fucking stupid. He didn't know what he didn't know what the afterlife of his text was going to be like hundreds of years later. He was in exile and he wrote The Prince.
Well, he wrote it for a small audience. Yeah.
Look. I overstated the point a little bit. The better example is Plato. If you read Plato, you can find the secret code there that this is meant only for the true followers. The true members of the cult will see the truth, and everyone else will read it in their introductory political science class, and they won't actually understand what's being said there.
Sure, yeah. There's a continuity between saying, okay, like having a reaction saying, oh, there's a conspiracy there, and saying, no, these are just people who think they know best.
Yeah.
This is just a group of people who think they fucking know best, and they think they know how to interpret texts, and that your interpretation is wrong. And they want to be in control so they can teach other people how they interpret, but not really give them like the code book for it, just tell them the conclusions of their interpretation.
But let me tell you, this is the basis of many of these Western canon, the best, the brightest, the most beautiful. This is the basis of their argument. And the reason that Alan Bloom, for example, was opposed to civil rights demonstrations taking place on campus. And he's like, I lost faith in the institution here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's that too. But I think
there's something to say if it is cult knowledge and it got you up to the White House and got you the invasions that you hoped for. I mean, it kind of worked.
Remember what culture really is defined as quite often, that guy from the 19th century, Matthew Arnold, the sweetness and light guy, defined culture as like the best that people have written in thought. And so culture is this sort of, that's elite, that's the elitist definition of culture. And these people buy into that definition of culture. Yes, culture is elitist. We are the priesthood of what is best in this country, our traditions, our values, our culture, and we will arbitrate between the powers that be and the scary masses, who's the real tyranny they're afraid of is the tyranny of the fucking masses. Those are because they're happy to set up tyrants and fucking dictators and all kinds of bullshit in other countries, but they don't want a tyranny of the masses. That's the bad thing. And they will arbitrate between, the elites will arbitrate between the politicians and the masses and tell the masses what cultures we should support and what we should condemn because they know best. That's the fucking idea. If that's a conspiracy, fine. People go into rooms and they talk to each other. That's what happens. I don't know where else people make plans. People conspire. People make plans. People do that. Conspiracy in a very mundane sense of a bunch of people getting together. Like when a document leaks on WikiLeaks, we say there's a conspiracy. I'm like, oh, no, that's actually just how people plan and coordinate their activities when they want to get what they want. It's not a fucking conspiracy. Or at least conspiracy has this connotation of this grand deep state scheme. Like we were saying earlier, though, it's not puppeteers. It's a bunch of tangled strings.
It's an open conspiracy in the sense that you don't need to do a conspiracy anymore. But anyone who says the West is in crisis, our best days are behind us, the past was better than the future will be, at least in some sense, like the conservative YouTube department, the Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, these people are coming from inside the house to destroy our great history of books and so on. That's downstream of you just need to read the best and the brightest and keep the secrets close to your chest. Don't let it get out. Don't let the people have it.
Yeah, like you can agree with that, but not agree with the explanation for why it is.
So you're opposed to calling this to the Leo Strauss conspiracy?
I would call it a conspiracy in the just like a very mundane dictionary definition term, where these people who are not always aligned, even within the neoconservative camp and the Leo Straussians, right? They're not always aligned, but I would think they have a broad kind of agreement, just the way a bunch of companies get together and form cartels and sort of, agree on what markets they're going to sell to or price fixing and things like that, right? They conspire in that sense. It's not like this sort of crazy New World Order QAnon conspiracy. It's just a fucking practical thing that people always do. Otherwise, someone else is going to do it and they're going to fuck you over.
And if you're a conservative intellectual, then you get a job at a think tank. Once you're done your degree at University of Chicago or Yale, then you get a job
doing it because it yields success and more success, and you just keep doing it. And people cast it in this paranoiac register, and they start, wearing tin hats and thinking they're being spied on or thought controlled, or all that sort of extreme reaction to the effectiveness of these strategies is probably part of the problem. right? We need a more clear-headed response. Get these fucking people out of power.
Didn't we just decide reading this Politics of Fear book that it is the most successful strategy? It's not a conspiracy of success. It is actual success, demonstrably.
Well, yeah, so far. Yeah, I would say so. And that's why we need a more clear-headed response and not like a paranoid kind of response that maybe is not going to be effective because it just promotes more and more fear. It's like a fear-based response to a fear-based politics, which is like fighting fire with fire. Well, no, that's not actually how you put out a fire.
A clear-headed explanation. Yeah, maybe. I'm a bit pessimistic.
You put out a fire by throwing water on it. You put out a fire by clear thinking, strategizing, using science and history and whatever other good means you have at your disposal.
So should we read some actual Leo Strauss for the next episode, or what do you think? I also found an article that like is a very like in international politics from 2005 that tries to make a really strong argument that Leo Strauss did influence the Bush administration. So we could read that if we want like a stronger case.
I do want to read that.
Like himself directly, because like William Crystal and some of them were very.
It's called Leo Strauss, Neoconservatism and the U.S. Foreign Policy, Esoteric Nihilism and the Bush Doctrine.
Esoteric nihilism.
Yeah, and the Bush Doctrine.
That's a very cool title. That would probably get to the heart of it.
It says, I argue neoconservatives are drawn from Strauss, a thematic agenda of sorts, which emphasizes the reinvocation of strong nationalism and cultural unity in modern Western societies.
Oh, here we go. It's all Leo Strauss. And he's Jewish, wasn't he?
Yep.
Yes, German Jewish, I think.
Yeah, so is like Irving Kristol. Many of the neoconservatives were Jewish and former Trotskyists.
Yeah, well, the one I mentioned before, Paul Wolfowitz, definitely like Jewish.
Yeah.
So they're all Jewish controlling?
Oh, yeah. I see where you're going with that. I don't think so. I didn't really look into all of their ethnic backgrounds.
Alan Bloom,
also Jewish. By the way, I wasn't suggesting anything. Okay, bye.
Whoops.
We found them. Oops. Okay, to be serious here, it would be much more interesting, I think, if this were all caused by ideas. But the politics of fear explanation is pretty simply, like, not to give the book away, but it's unions of business owners and corporate PACs give money to people who stoke fear. That's it. That's the end of the explanation. Kind of boring. I wish it was more than that, but I think that's probably correct.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
By the way,
historically, funding really kicked off after the 60s, right? It says during the post-World War II boom, corporate political donations to both major parties had been modest, but this changed dramatically in the mid-70s, right? When the U.S. economy, after 30 years of prosperity, underwent a precipitous decline. So there's a history to the ramping up of funding of political parties by the corporate elites, right? And that's going to create a change in politics too, because now politics is no longer trying to sort of just appeal to the masses, but now they have to apply for funding to this corporate elite, right? And so their ideology now is going to have to match, the corporate people rather than the people in the masses of people, right? So that's going to create a huge shift. And this is another sort of nutrient in the soil of the blooming of this far right. Well, this new right. I'll say the far right now is an extension of it, maybe. But yeah.
If you're interested in a way in which ideas are concretely influencing American politics, I think you'd find it kind of amusing and interesting the extent to which they influence a lot of Supreme Court decisions that actually do have a lot of effects. Like right now, like the conservatives are obsessed with this idea of history and tradition to like justify their decisions. And like recently, I don't know, there's a really weird thing going on right now.
Do you have an example?
The Supreme Court. So like like in 2021, the case that like read the Constitution as concrete as when it says like a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The way that that last clause is interpreted is like, it's really funny and weird, the battle over like what history to read to support it, because the conservatives want to say, oh, that means each individual should be allowed to carry a gun outside the home, and like they just kind of like selectively search history and then ignore other history, and there's this whole weird battle of ideas. And like, it's funny because when you read the decisions, like you have all the liberals on the other side being like, look at this example of history when they were regulating guns, look at this example, and then the conservatives are just like, no, this example from history, this tradition that we have. And it's like, it's just like a weird battle over interpreting history, which I don't know if that's exactly ideas influencing, but
it's a hermeneutic of text to find.
It's a hermeneutic of text that then ends up having real world consequences, like huge real world consequences.
Ideas are, yeah, we're saying ideas. Well, Pills likes to say ideas don't matter.
But I thought of you because I just think that it's funny to kind of like, there's a lot of stuff. I've been kind of obsessed with this a little bit lately. Like, it's just funny to kind of laugh at like the things, because they always invoke this category of history and tradition as being like where they ground their decisions. And it's like, and they pretend that that's like more objective. And it's like, oh, the left wingers are just like, you know, they're talking about purpose, the purpose of the law. And it's like, well, that could mean anything. And it's like, but history and tradition is like a concrete thing that we can point to and we can find examples. And it's just like, it's kind of crazy.
That's part of it. We always claim our ideas and our interpretations of things are grounded in like the real history. If we're going to go that way, we'll say, well, yours is, you know, your history, you got history wrong, therefore your ideas are false, or that's like a fabricated kind of history. This is what we say about things like, you know, nostalgia too, right? Nostalgia projects a past that never was, but it still has real consequences if you can convince people that, you know, it was real, or that we can get back to that, or that we can create something like it moving forward.
This is the exchange process, and the exchange process has faith and fear at its bottom, values at its bottom.
Yeah, so it goes back. That's the real history there. It's like the history of production, right? Making guns and selling guns and making money and convincing people that we need more guns because the world's not a safe place. Politics of fear coming in there.
No, now you're switching between material exchange as the fundamental basis of sociality, and I'm trying to say that it's values as the fundamental basis. You know, Eric, I don't really like this Marxist bent on it. You're being too Marxist. Calm it down.
That's a method of investigating. It's not really like,
hey, semiotics is too, and you used to be with me.
Yeah, I guess you could say, you can argue about all the semantics of all these things all day, but yeah, historical materialism would be a method.
Oh God, he's been radicalized, folks. We're gonna have to pick this up on another time because we are at time. So, yeah, next week we'll read how Strauss is actually the godfather of getting his ideas up to the, what is it? Up to the White House?
Yeah, running them up the ladder. Seems like he did.
All right, catch you guys next week.
All right.